Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Good evening and welcome to Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. And tonight we have got a lot to unpack as Dorian is now a hurricane and could be heading for the southeast United States. Joining me in a few minutes will be the Chief Meteorologist at WNCT-TV in Greenville, North Carolina, Jerry Jackson. As we break down the forecast, he'll chime in on what's going on with Dorian now, and he'll look back 8 years ago to Hurricane Irene. I can't believe that was 8 years ago. Now, during tonight's show, if there's anything you would like to know or subjects you would like us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, I know there might be a lot of questions tonight about Dorian, please email us. That email address is sendit@cbs17.com. Sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, so we would love to hear from you. If you would like to get in touch with me and Jerry personally, this is how you can do it on Facebook. I am Weather Wes Hohenstein, and Jerry is WNCT Jerry Jackson. WNCT Jerry Jackson. All right, so before we get to Jerry on the coast, let's kind of take a step back and look big picture about what's going on with Dorian now, what happened today, and our thoughts going forward. So the big news today is Dorian became a hurricane. Remember, it missed all those big mountains in the island of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, so it didn't have anything to weaken it. So it just kept strengthening it. Now, it went over the Virgin Islands, but that's kind of the big news of today. It missed all those mountains. It didn't have a chance to weaken, so what did it do instead? It strengthened into a hurricane. And now, an even stronger system, because it didn't weaken, could be heading for the southeast United States. So in the next 48 hours, it's going to actually grow in size, first of all. Remember, we talked about this a few times over the past few days. Maybe you've seen it or heard it. Dorian was a small storm. Now it's going to start to get bigger. In addition to that, it does not have any dry air. It does not have any wind shear. It does not have any land in front of it. It's got a lot of warm water, and that's bad news for anyone in the path of it. But as for impacts in the United States, it's looking more and more likely that this is going to target Florida sometime Sunday or Monday. Now, there's still a wide cone out there, but that's the most likely scenario. Not out of the mix just yet is North Carolina, because we could get some side effects. South Carolina too, Georgia too. So a lot of places are still in play, as this is about ready to be a big and very powerful system. Now, on any other night at the end of August, the big story would be there's a cold front sweeping across the East Coast. That's going to drop some temperatures and lower the humidity, give us a great feel at the end of August. Again, that's for most of the East Coast. And then just to the right of that is Tropical Depression Erin, not getting a lot of publicity because of Dorian, and because honestly, there's just not a whole lot to it. It's far enough away. There's no major impacts on the East Coast, and that's about to move away. It was Tropical Storm Erin, became a depression today. So let's spend most of our time talking about Dorian. Again, the very latest from the National Hurricane Center. This is the 8 o'clock advisory. Winds have held at 80 miles per hour. They're gusting up to 100 miles per hour. So remember, it missed Puerto Rico, which has a lot of tall mountains, but all these islands, the Virgin Islands, the British and the U.S. Virgin Islands, they don't have mountains. They're low-lying, and they're small, and it's mainly water. And so Dorian cruised right through all that and was able to strengthen. It's moving slowly, which is kind of important. So it's moving 13 miles an hour. And this is not expected to approach the United States until Sunday or Monday. So 4 days and 1,162 miles between the east coast of Florida and the center of Dorian. That's a long way to go. So we have plenty of time to prepare. We don't need to panic. We can kind of sit back and watch it as we kind of get things in order that we need to get in order. But that also means that's a lot of time and a lot of space and water for things to change. And this fluctuation in the forecast track that we've already lived through, it's going to continue. And one of the reasons why is because we're running computer models every 6 to 12 hours. Hurricane Hunter aircraft is out there pretty much nonstop, so we're getting all kinds of new data. So things are going to change. Here are the latest computer models. This was the late afternoon Wednesday run. And so we start off just east of Puerto Rico. And I'm going to kind of take it segment by segment. So the cluster of computer models, we look at two things. We look at the trends. We look at, well, where are the lines going now compared to where they were going 12 hours ago? And we also look at where the cluster goes. So when they're bunched up close together like this, that tells us, hey, there's a lot of confidence. There's a lot of computer models out there that agree that this is what this thing is going to do. It's going to stay northwest for the next 36 hours. And a lot of them agree, too, on that left turn, that westerly push that unfortunately will bring it closer to the United States. See how they're still mostly clustered? But then watch what happens as it gets closer to Florida. Things start to spread out. When we see a big spread like this that literally goes from South Carolina all the way down to, the Fort Lauderdale area, I mean, that's 600 miles. When we see a spread like this and we even have a couple outliers that are curving it offshore, that tells us, like, okay, hold on here. We're not as certain as we'd like to be. So what does that mean? That means we have to pay attention whether you're in Florida, Georgia, or the Carolinas. And, for those living in Bermuda, who knows? We've seen some strange loop-de-loops over the years. Two of the main computer models we look at, the European and the American model, the GFS. I've kind of isolated those two, and I pinpointed Sunday night at 10 o'clock. So I've got the European model, everything in yellow. These are isobars. So where we see these isobars circle up and get tight, that's where the center of the hurricane could be, Sunday night at 10. American model in red, European in yellow. And look how similar they are. So two things I take from this. Number one, they're kind of close. They're not on top of each other, but they're also not 600 miles away. All right, so that tells us maybe we really do need to start paying close attention to Florida. It also tells me that Sunday night at 10 o'clock, I mean, this thing could still be over water, strengthening. Maybe it'll catch a cold eddy or something and weaken. But this is another sign that, hey, this is more and more likely a possibility for a landfall in Florida Sunday or Monday. So those were the computer models. Here's the official track from the National Hurricane Center. Again, expected to continue northwest, slowly strengthening, 90-mile-an-hour winds Thursday afternoon, making that west or left turn, becoming a Category 2 storm Friday, but it's a Cat 3 Saturday and Sunday as it skims maybe over or just north of the Bahamas. Again, a lot of warm water, low wind shear. I mean, everything is perfect for this thing to really develop. And then smashing into the Florida coastline maybe late Sunday or Monday, Monday being Labor Day. So I want to put the center line in from the 5 o'clock advisory. So that's the middle of this track. And I want to compare that to the 11 a.m. advisory, the previous. I'm going to drop that line in there in white. So this shows us how the track has changed. So it might be swinging out a little farther to the north. Again, white to red, that's our progression. But as it gets closer to Florida, the 5 o'clock advisory actually shifted it a little south. Now, negligible, not a big shift, but a little shift. And we will track these over the course of the coming days. Here's what it looks like close up. Again, Sunday at 2 o'clock. It could be anywhere from north of the Bahamas. It could be just off the coast of Miami. So anywhere from South Florida to really Georgia, that's where the center of the storm can be. And remember, that's what the cone of uncertainty means. Again, the cone means the eye of the hurricane could be within this shaded yellow area 2/3 of the time. Remember, it's not guaranteed. This is a 5-day forecast. So 2/3 of the time, the eye could be here, but it could also be down here Monday afternoon in the Gulf of Mexico, or it could be up here in the northern fringe, which would bring more impacts to the Carolinas. So keep that in mind. When you look at that cone, that doesn't mean here's who could get impacted. That means this is where the center could be, and the impact with a storm that's going to be 500 miles across could be much greater than that. I mentioned the warm water. I've overlaid the forecast track where this storm is going to go with some current water temperatures. This is bath water. Mid to upper 80s. That is the perfect temperature to get this storm really going. Now, where it goes, again, you saw the spread of the models. It's still really up in the air, but one of the things the forecast models are trying to figure out, and we're trying to figure out, where the ridge of high pressure over the Atlantic Ocean is going to go. The stronger that is, the bigger that is, the more it's going to push the storm back to the west, because tropical systems are fairly lazy. They like to take the path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance would be, hey, I'm going to thread right in between these two areas of high pressure. Texas, the south, high pressure, really hot temperatures. High pressure over the Atlantic Ocean. So if this thing weakens, that would tend to lead us to believe it's going to curve a little sooner. somewhere in between maybe is what's going to happen. So we will watch very closely what's going to happen with that area of high pressure. And I'll finish with this before we bring in Jerry to get his thoughts. We have the ability to kind of go back in time and look at all the tropical tracks throughout history. So we went back to 1950. Every tropical system back to 1950 that passed within 100 miles of where Dorian is right now. So 1950, so we're talking almost 70 years of data. There have been dozens and dozens of storms. Here they are all plotted up. There has only been one to make landfall in Florida that have come within 100 miles of where Dorian is now since 1950. And that was Gene back in 2004. Look where most of them go. Most of them curve out to the ocean. Few of them slid into the Gulf, but none of them have really made that left turn and smashed into Florida. And that's interesting because Florence last year was one of those storms that had never done anything like what happened to it. And I remember showing a map like this with Florence and talking about how, hey, listen, these are the forecasts. We're going to watch it. But look at the history. This has never happened before. And sure enough, it happened. So this could be a second since 1950 storm to smash into Florida. All right, so that is a lot to cover with Dorian. Let's jump now to our first guest of the night. And he is in Eastern North Carolina, and this is a live shot from Eastern North Carolina. So let's welcome back in Jerry Jackson. He was with us a few weeks ago. Jerry's chief meteorologist at WNC-TV in Greenville, North Carolina. Jerry, all right, I know the coast of North Carolina, and you guys are watching this thing really closely. Share your thoughts with us about what you've been seeing with Dorian, watching it for the past several days now.
Well, you bring us some very interesting points, Wes, especially that little piece of climatology you were sharing about how unlikely it can be for systems passing by that particular point. But there are a lot of interesting things about this system. Let's get started. I want to show you first. This is a graphic, actually, of the earliest reasonable arrival time of tropical storm force winds. This is a product that is generated by our friends with the National Hurricane Center and National Weather Service cooperation. It's very useful because it gives you kind of the absolute worst case scenario. If this thing were just to suddenly go crazy and just take off in a beeline and head for Florida, what would be the absolute earliest onset of tropical storm force winds? And you can see that that would still probably not occur for residents of Florida until sometime later on Saturday. So again, as Wes was telling you, we've got plenty of time still to track this. Nothing to be panicking about, even if you do currently reside in Florida. Obviously, here in Eastern North Carolina, we're watching this system with great interest as well to see what happens with it. We're actually watching two systems out there, as Wes was alluding to. We've got Aaron. It looks strange because you look at the circle here and you say, well, gee, we've drawn it in the wrong place because all the red's down here. This is actually the center of circulation right in here, and all the thunderstorms are blown off to the southern side. So it's a very disorganized system. Already moving to the north. That's why we're not really worried about Aaron. It's never going to make it in here. Here is Dorian. It certainly does look healthy this evening. And if you're not familiar with how infrared color tables are set up, usually when you think of hot, you think of the color red. Here you have to think backwards. Whenever you see these deeper reds blowing up, those are really cold cloud tops. In other words, the thunderstorms are growing in height. This is a very healthy storm right now, and it's about to move over basically a zone where it has little to slow it down in terms of intensification. So this is a storm that is going to likely remain healthy in the short term. Max sustained winds already up to 80 miles an hour. And again, eventually the most likely landfall point at this point does indeed appear to be Florida. But as Wes was emphasizing, you can see this center line, this cone of uncertainty does not represent the left and right edge of the storm. It represents the margin of error for the center track. So there's a lot of wiggle room. We've been counting on an area of high pressure building in far to the north, and if it stays dominant, it will block the escape route for Dorian and force it on this westerly course. The only problem is that high is not going to be able to maintain its position forever. Eventually it's going to shift or break down or some such over the next week or so, and once that happens, it kind of opens up the door for Dorian to begin to recurve. Now, does that recurving happen over land? Does it happen once it gets in the Gulf of Mexico? Does it actually turn, head up the coast? Any of those options are still on the table. So Florida is the main interest in the short term through the weekend. Beyond that, still a lot of uncertainty. And for us here in Eastern North Carolina, obviously this is something we want to watch. Even if Dorian were to track inland and stay on a hard westerly course and get over land, the remnant circulation coming back up next week would actually put us in a favorable zone for tornado production here in eastern North Carolina, especially later Tuesday into Wednesday. So even if we deal with the leftovers of this system, there could still be some impacts that we would have to watch out for. And of course, if the leftover moisture mingles in with any nearby fronts or whatever weather features may be in play in the middle part of next week, that could enhance locally heavy rainfall across our area too. There's always something to watch this time of year, as we all know. And Wes was alluding to a big weather anniversary we have here in the state of North Carolina, Hurricane Irene. Of course, Irene made landfall back on October 27th of 2011. Hard to believe that that much time has passed already. The years certainly do fly by. We all here in eastern North Carolina remember Irene very well. It reached a peak intensity near the Bahamas, just off to the east of Florida, as a Category 3 hurricane, 120-mile-per-hour winds. Thankfully for us, it weakened a lot on its final approach, all the way down to Category 1 intensity. And you see the size of Irene there on the map. As was often the case when systems make landfall, they tend to unwrap and unwind. So the footprint of the rain expands across many, many states. And we saw plenty of flooding rain totals here in eastern North Carolina. In fact, in some cases, we had common 10 to 14 inches, and a few isolated spots in eastern North Carolina picked up as much as 15, 16, 17 inches of rain. Of course, the rain was not the only issue we had to deal with. Tornadoes were spawned, several of them that produced widespread damage, including across parts of Washington, Tyrrell, and also Beaufort counties. Very strong tornadoes with Irene when it came through. In fact, this is one of the signatures that we had on the radar display when Irene was moving in. And you can see the dark red and or kind of the bright red and bright green pixels there in close proximity. That indicates differing wind direction. In other words, rotation. So that was a very strong, what we call couplet, indicating tornado activity. And of course, the winds in general were strong with Hurricane Irene when it moved through, including a 115-mile-per-hour gust out towards the Cedar Island area too. Certainly more than enough to create widespread wind damage here in the eastern part of the state. Of course, storm surge was one of the biggest problems with Irene. When that storm hit, I was actually working at a little station down in Wilmington, North Carolina. We, in that market, were on the weaker side of Irene. Here in eastern North Carolina at WNCT, our viewing area that I serve currently was actually located on the stronger side of Irene, where the storm surge was maximized. This is a before and after picture. This is the Pea Island Wildlife Refuge area, if you're familiar with where that is, up around the Dare County area. This is a before Irene picture, and notice the land on either side of that little building that you see highlighted with the arrow. And this is the after picture. That shows you what a strong storm surge can do if it's coming in at the right angle of approach. And here's a different view of that same shot, kind of taken from the side there. And you can see along portions of the Outer Banks how basically Irene reshaped our coastline in quite a few areas. And NC Highway 12, of course, as is often the case with landfalling systems, suffered a lot of damage and was non-usable in a few spots for a long, long time after that. And of course, the storm surge effects reached across several counties. And it brings up a point that we always like to emphasize to viewers, especially if you are new to hurricanes. The amount of damage that a hurricane produces depends on more than just the strength of the storm. We oftentimes get so focused on what the category is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and rightfully so. The winds are very important. But you can also have a lot of damage depending on the direction in which the storm is moving. You know, you think back to Irene. Irene was only a Category 1 on its final approach. Hurricane Florence was a relatively weak hurricane when it finally hit land. It was much stronger out over the water, of course. Hurricane Matthew was a very strong storm over the water south of us, but when it hit land, it was weakening and falling apart. Yet these storms caused significant catastrophic levels of damage in our state. And you have to remember that even a weak storm, if it's coming in at just the right angle, if it's coming in fast enough or slow enough, depending on the setup, even a weak hurricane can cause just as much, if not more damage than a stronger hurricane. And of course, meteorological history, what was happening in the weeks and months leading up to the storm too. I think back to Hurricane Floyd back in 1999, as we come back out to camera here with our director here. Back in 1999, Hurricane Floyd we're coming up on that anniversary too. We all remember the devastating flooding we had in North Carolina, but that was partially due to the excessive rain we saw from Hurricane Dennis about 3 weeks before. So to gauge the impact of a hurricane, you have to look not only at what's going on at the time the hurricane's hitting, but everything that happened 2 or 3 weeks leading up to it. Had it been excessively dry, or has it been excessively wet? All of that plays into the type of impact you see with the landfalling system. And Wes, as you know, you can take 2 storms identical in size, in strength, and intensity and structure, completely identical. And yet if you bring one storm in from the east and one storm from the south, you'll get 2 completely different damage patterns. It's that complicated.
Yeah. Let me ask you about Irene 8 years ago. Since then, we've had storms like Florence and Matthew affect eastern part of the Carolinas. Do people forget Irene now and remember those more recent storms, or are there still marks in town and people who, like, Irene was it for them?
That's a good point, and it gets back to what we try to tell people, especially who are new to the area. Again, my example, when I was down in Wilmington working, when Irene came in, I was a meteorologist down at the station in that area, and so we were on the western side of the storm. So for our counties, we had damage, don't get me wrong, we had problems, but I think for a lot of residents in that viewing area down there, Irene does kind of fall to the wayside in the presence of storms like Matthew and Florence. Whereas in the viewing area I serve now here at WNCT, we cover 29 counties. Many of our counties, especially out towards Albemarle, Pamlico Sound, they were on the stronger side of Irene. So for them, the memories are much stronger and very different. And that's why sometimes it can be misleading. A viewer will say, okay, well, a few years ago, I remember a Category 1 hurricane coming in and I didn't have any problems, so I'm not going to worry about the next Category 1. Well, if that Category 1 is coming in such a way that you happen to be on the different side of it now, you could be looking at a different ballgame. In other words, the weather 60 miles to the east of center is completely different than 60 miles to the west of center, as you know. Yeah,
yeah. One more thing about Dorian, and I'll get you out of here on this. You know, North Carolina sticks out on the East Coast, and most all storms eventually turn north at some point. Sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later. So do you and do people in eastern North Carolina, are they like, okay, I see it's going to Florida, but I know how these things work. I showed you that map, how a lot of them curve. Do eastern North Carolinians have a different feel for storms despite what meteorology says sometimes?
Those of us who have lived down here a long time, I remember starting as a Met over 20 years ago. The chief I worked for at the time, that was one of the first things he impressed upon me is the fact that if a storm is if there's going to be error in the track, almost always it's to the right of where it's forecast to go. And so I've always kept that in my mind. I know a lot of viewers around here who have been through many storms think the same way. So not that you wish harm on anyone, but from North Carolina's perspective right now, it looks like, you know, the worst of it would stay south of us and go into Florida. But we all know, don't take that too literally, because there are too many moving pieces, especially this far out in advance. And for a solution to work out properly in a forecast track, you've got, okay, you have your rationale. Okay, the storm's going to track this way because of this high, because of this low, because of this front, whatever. And you have all the pieces set. Well, that'll work out perfectly as long as the storm doesn't slow down, or it weakens a little bit, or strengthens a little bit. In other words, when you change one variable, it changes how it interacts with every other variable too. And you have more variables to deal with as you head farther out in time. So to accurately forecast a hurricane, you have to accurately forecast every weather feature around it, and that's almost impossible to do 5 days in advance.
Yeah. You are right, and we've got 5 days and more than 1,000 miles between us and Dorian. So good luck to you guys and everyone in the Carolinas, especially in the east coast of North Carolina. That is Jerry Jackson at WNCT in Greenville, North Carolina. Hopefully we will not have to talk to you later this season, but it is still early in the hurricane season. Jerry, thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Have a good one.
All right, so with Dorian and with Aaron, we have now checked a few more names off our list. So Aaron is the 5th named storm this season. Dorian, the 4th named storm, but remember, the 2nd hurricane. And a little bit of climatology here. And Dr. Phil Klausbach, a great hurricane forecaster from Colorado State University, he tweeted out some interesting information earlier. So Dorian, now the second hurricane of the 2019 Atlantic season to date. The average date for the second hurricane of the season, and when we're talking average, we're going back the last 30 years. So the average date for the second hurricanes to form, August 28th, which is today. So a bit of irony in the hurricane climatology for today. Ferdinand, by the way, is next on the list, but there is nothing else out there that we are watching. As we kind of look at the whole hurricane season, remember, the hurricane season peaks in September on the Atlantic side, September 10th. And this graph kind of shows how hurricane and tropical activity ramps up throughout the year. And even though things might seem busy with Aaron and Dorian, we are still on the front side of the peak. So we are, again, August 28th. We still have a ways to go before we get to the peak. And I think we all remember, you think back to the worst hurricanes, they happen a lot in September. And September is still yet to come, although September does start on Sunday. One other thing I wanted to show you before we say goodbye tonight, and that is the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. They are out there right now flying through the center. So these planes have anywhere from 5 to a dozen people on them. They have been based, since the storm was so far out there, at Barbados, that little island down here at the very bottom. So from here on out, once they finish this reconnaissance flight, and again, they stay out there for hours and hours on end, and when they're done, another one goes out and they kind of cross paths. They're going to head back to the home base, either in Biloxi, Mississippi at Keesler Air Force Base or MacDill Air Force Base just outside of Tampa. So they've been spending some time out in the Caribbean islands, not vacationing, but being closer to the storm for the aircraft. Now that the storm is going to start heading for the United States, they'll head back home and they'll start making their flights from the mainland United States. And, you know, I was lucky enough to earlier this year spend a day with the Hurricane Hunter aircraft and the crew during the Hurricane Awareness Tour at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport. And here's what it takes to fly into a monster storm.
Times where the plane has been shaking so violently I could not read my instruments for a good 20 or 30 seconds. And that's where it gets interesting.
Chief Reconnaissance Coordinator Warren Madden showed us around the C-130 Hurricane Hunter aircraft while recounting one of his more memorable rides.
The lightning was rippling along the eye wall in all quadrants. It was almost like being inside, imagine being inside a brain with all the electric activity, nerve activity firing across. And then you could look up, and if you got your head right up against the side of the window and looked up, there was this just hole in the middle. This was a night flight with stars and a full moon staring down at you.
For more than 70 years, aircraft in one form or another have been flying into hurricanes to collect data to help improve the forecasts of where these monster storms are going.
Everyone thinks it's crazy to fly into a hurricane, but how important is it to you and the rest of the forecasters to have that data from inside the hurricane?
To a meteorologist, data is everything. So, I mean, we have satellites, we have information like buoys, but to be able to send a plane right into a storm, right into the eye, it gives us all sorts of information from the winds to the pressure. The better the models, the better the forecast, the better the decisions, and it leads to lives saved.
Most flights last around 12 hours. Once the pilot gets the plane to the storm, the scientists in the back get to work by releasing dropsondes into the storm.
So there's a sensor here that records the temperature and humidity. There's a barometer inside that records the pressure as it falls, and there's also a GPS receiver in here. So 4 times a second as it falls, it's reporting back where it is.
These dropsondes have been shown to improve hurricane forecasts, but they can't exactly stick their hand out the window to deploy them from 10,000 feet.
We load the dropsonde in here. This is the loadmaster's job. We'll load it in here, and then they'll close down this to cover it up and establish a good seal. And then when the time comes to release it, a little port will open up at the bottom of the aircraft, and then the spring will fire down, eject those sondes.
It takes only 4 minutes for the dropsondes to splash into the ocean, but the collected data is sent back to the airplane instantly, checked for quality, and forwarded on to the National Hurricane Center minutes later, where it is put into the hands of meteorologists and computer models all over the world.
I'm okay doing this. I'm okay asking my crew to do this as long as the people back home make sure I'm not doing it for nothing.
Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Ragusa is the Hurricane Hunter chief pilot and has been flying the C-130 for more than 20 years. He says getting that data back can sometimes be quite a ride.
It can range from nothing worse than a bad commercial airline flight to oh my goodness, what are we doing out here kind of experience.
For Lieutenant Colonel Ragusa, Hurricane Dean in 2007 gave him and his crew a ride they'll never forget. They flew into that Category 5 storm as it slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula.
We have a computer voice in the airplane. Her name is Ann. She talks to us when she doesn't like what's going on. going on, and I'm pretty sure on that mission I heard every word Ann knows.
And our thanks to all the men and women of the U.S. Air Force who risk their lives to get us better information so we can stay on top of these storms. Listen, we're going to do these shows the rest of this week. So we're going to be back Thursday and Friday night at 8 o'clock right here for more on what's happening with Hurricane Dorian. Of course, I'd like to thank you for spending some of your night with us on Eye of the Storm. Don't forget, in addition to Thursday and Friday and into the weekend at 8 o'clock, we're here every Wednesday at 8 o'clock through the entire Atlantic hurricane season. So thanks for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Wes Hohenstein. We leave you with a live look at Ocean Isle Beach. Maybe if we all close our eyes really tight, we can be there, or just look at this video and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.